Why Progressives Shouldn't Fight Each Other Over How to Vote in 2020 by Keaton of Due Dissidence. Last September, I had the pleasure of interviewing Nick Branya, founder and national director for the Movement for a People's Party. Anticipating a possible repeat of the 2016 primary in which Bernie Sanders would be denied the nomination by a combination of Democratic Party chicanery and Democratic voter vapidity, I asked him how he thought his organization should approach the question of how progressives ought to vote in the general election, assuming someone like Joe Biden would be the nominee. Says Nick, "I would stay out of it," he said. "Encourage people to vote for whomever they want. We're not going to take a position on that. We're not going to fracture this coalition. What we do agree on is that we need a major new party in the immediate aftermath." His answer struck me as a wise one at the time, and it still does. Nonetheless, this banal and counterproductive debate over who to vote for in 2020 is still dominating online left circles. Many leftists, myself included, feel a vote for Biden would grant undeserved legitimacy to a Democratic Party that openly despises us and rigs its primaries against our candidates. We will therefore withhold our vote from him in the fall. Joe Biden, after all, is the frontman for this callous and corrupt political machine that harbors such contempt for progressives that its paramount goal this campaign season was to crush the Bernie Sanders movement, whose core demand was something as modest as the de-commodification of health insurance in the world's richest country. Even now, amidst a once-in-a-century pandemic, we hope, the DNC Platform Committee just voted 125 to 36 against Medicare for All, despite its overwhelming nationwide popularity. Given that their first priority was to destroy the leftmost candidate in the field and vanquish his coalition back to the fringes of the political landscape where they were once relegated, many leftists are simply unmovable in our aversion to supporting the Democratic ticket. I have to say, Keaton, I'm right with you to this point. Others, however, feel that in spite of their nearly identical critique of Biden and the Democrats, they simply must vote for him in order to prevent another disastrous Trump term, which this time would begin during a once-in-a-century crisis that he has proven woefully ill-equipped to handle. To be clear, these are not the comfortable upper-middle-class resistant suburbanites who opposed Sanders from the start, or the mindless blue MAGA Twitter drones who delude themselves with nonsense about how Joe Biden is the solution to all of our problems, nor are they the asinine settle for Biden sheepdogs whose facetious tongue-in-cheek social media campaign is an unfunny and off-putting resignation to indefinite lesser evilism. The leftists I speak of are not blinded by privilege, brainwashed by corporate media, or ready to settle for anything. They share our contempt for the Democratic establishment, our disgust at how this election has turned out, and our eagerness to take to the streets to demand meaningful change. They differ from us only in that they feel too cornered in this particular election cycle to do anything but pull the lever for Joe Biden in November. Too cornered. They feel too cornered in this particular election cycle. For one thing, if they meet all these requirements that Keaton has laid out, I'd say they're a mythical unicorn beast. I haven't met anybody who isn't a blue MAGA Twitter drone, or a wine track mom, or an asinine settle for Biden sheepdog, who can say with good conscience that they're going to vote for Joe Biden. So if this group even exists, I'd say it's a very small one. Once again, I am not neutral on this issue. I don't plan to vote for Joe Biden. In a safe blue state like New York, this decision took all of half a second to arrive at. But whatever your opinion and wherever you live, I live in Pennsylvania and I'm also not voting for Joe Biden. It would behoove all of us on the left to respect each other's voting preferences. And that's where we disagree. That's where I say, fuck that shit. I'm not respecting anybody's voting preference if they say they're voting for Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. He goes on to say, we don't like it when centrist Democrats vote shame us. The reason we don't like it is because they're wrong to do it. Our choice is perfectly legitimate. But their choice to vote for any corporatist, such as Hillary Rodham Clinton, or Barack Obama, or Joe Biden, this is not legitimate. These choices are not legitimate. They should be vote shamed. But back to that sentence. We don't like it when centrist Democrats vote shame us into supporting their candidates, and so why should we push each other around in the same way? And I would say we're not pushing each other around if we're not all progressives. Progressives should instead be willing to agree to disagree with each other on the question of how to vote in 2020. Progressives are not progressives if they're voting for Joe Biden. We should keep our feet off of that slippery slope. Anyway, to finish that sentence, progressives should instead be willing to agree to disagree with each other on the question of how to vote in 2020, so long as we share a larger understanding of how to move forward as a movement up until after November 3rd, no matter who wins on that day. Which is exactly like saying that we should get Biden in and then push him to the left. That ain't gonna happen. Remember, in the grand scheme of things, that's where we start sounding like pragmatists. That's where we start sounding like incrementalist, centrist Democrats. Remember, in the grand scheme of things, the act of voting itself requires almost no effort and makes up a minuscule percentage of what it actually means to be an engaged citizen. Okay, that's true. If you're reading this, your interest in current affairs is no doubt such that your contribution to political discourse extends far beyond the few seconds it takes to check a box on a ballot. True again. Therefore, your vote, contrary to prevailing media narratives, is actually an extremely limited expression of your political power as an individual. Far more significant than how you vote is how you exercise that power between election cycles. So that's obviously true. Therefore, the only way to tackle that argument is to say that voting matters for more reasons than simply its power. Even though voting has no power right now, it has symbolic significance, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And so in the 2020 election, where there simply is no good candidate to vote for, to be overly precious about your selection is particularly misguided. Precious. That's loaded language. And that it only serves to divide the progressive coalition. The coalition, the progressive coalition. It isn't a progressive coalition if the people in it aren't progressive. And the whole idea of a progressive coalition sounds dangerously similar to the Democrats who plea for vote blue no matter who party unity. Such fragmentation would be especially unfortunate right now, as the George Floyd protests are proving every day how effective a united left movement can be outside the realm of electoral politics. Let me stop right here for a moment and say that the George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement will not prevail if we don't morph somehow into poor people's marches. If this movement merely concerns itself with race, then Nike and all the big companies can wade in and say, oh yeah, we're concerned too. Unless it morphs into a movement to achieve economic justice, we're going to have the same problems as we will with the progressive movement if it doesn't also become clearly a movement to help the working poor. Even with the election having gone sideways, a bright ray of hope has appeared in the form of the resurgent and revitalized Black Lives Matter movement, which is forcefully and successfully protesting for racial and economic justice in cities large and small throughout the United States. Not only has public opinion shifted dramatically in support of BLM, but city councils across the country are accommodating their demands by defunding their police departments. Anyone who supports this direct action campaign and other social justice movements like it, regardless of who they vote for on November 3rd, should be welcome in our coalition and encouraged to fight alongside us where it matters most. We lost the big prize at the ballot box, but the progressive movement is undoubtedly winning in the streets where mass politics has always been most potent. But again, I would say it does matter who they vote for on November 3rd if they really are in the coalition. But I'll get to that in a minute. I'll explain that in more detail in a minute. At this paradoxical time in which a groundswell of inspiring activism is flourishing against the backdrop of an utterly hopeless election season, picking our battles is especially important. Do we jeopardize the cohesiveness of our movement? Now here's where we're dangerously close to being a sheepdog. By sniping at each other over how to vote, or do we set such differences aside and unite behind our winning strategy of mass politics and direct action? To me, it's a no-brainer. If you're willing to join the grassroots struggle for justice, equality, and universal human dignity, and you understand that this fight must be escalated in the coming years, regardless of who wins this farce of an election, then you're good in my book. To be inflexible on the issue of voting blue or green or not at all is, as Nick would put it, to unnecessarily fracture our coalition. This is the dangerous part right here. It's throwing good money after bad money and driving a wedge through a movement that now more than ever needs to multiply its forces, not divide them. None of this is to say that it doesn't matter who wins in November. It's simply to say that regardless of who wins the election, we're going to need a powerhouse progressive movement that's ready to rumble in its wake, and that keeping such a movement united will require some flexibility on our part. That's the dangerous language right there. On the issue of how our fellow comrades decide to vote. The devil's advocate argument for the Democrats is that as much as they share the Republicans' indifference, if not outright contempt, towards poor and working class people, they at least seem to want the system to function. They want the trains to run on time. Republicans, on the other hand, have more of an overt death drive. Their leadership seems perfectly willing to sacrifice the humanity at the altar of Reaganite austerity and bootstrap economics. They're literally saying in public that seniors should be willing to die to save the market. Plus, much of their base has been preparing for a crisis like the coronavirus outbreak since the publication of the Turner Diaries. They're heavily armed, they've got plenty of canned food, and enough barbed wire to circle the perimeters of their property lines. Their response to an apocalyptic pandemic-induced depression is more in the vein of, "Bring it on, motherfucker." The Republicans are less inclined to blink first in a showdown with a mass uprising because their ideological commitment to rugged individualism is so strong that they might simply let society crash and burn before succumbing to the necessity for government intervention. Cosmopolitan liberals, by contrast, need bartenders to pour their Pinot, drivers to chauffeur them around, and maids to clean their townhouses and summer homes. For this reason, they're much more likely to cave to the demands of, say, a general strike or other disruptive protest movements that cause widespread societal disturbance. So just as I am not neutral on the question of how to vote, again, I'm not voting for Biden, I'm also not completely neutral on the question of who I would rather see in the White House come January 2021. The composition of the Democratic Party is such that it's more likely to cower in the face of a popular uprising and cave to its demands, I wish, making it the ever so slightly more attractive piñata for us to ruthlessly bludgeon over the next 4 years until they do just that. But here's the rub. Without the popular uprising, we're fucked either way. Therefore, our first priority right now should be to hold together our coalition through the final months of this campaign and be ready to raise hell in its immediate aftermath and try to push Joe Biden to the left. Yeah. For all these reasons, I would like to see the infighting amongst progressives about people's personal voting preferences dissipate. It's pointless at best, given that an individual vote simply doesn't matter as much as most people think it does. It's 1 in 130 million. Yeah, but it's the principle of the thing. At worst, it's destructive in that neoliberal hegemony of the Democratic and Republican variety, and it's ultimately the main beneficiary of a fractured left. So if you're still wrestling with the pedantic question of how to vote in this embarrassment of an election, here's my advice. Stop worrying about it and stop fighting over it. Vote however you feel you must. No. And allow others the space to do the same. No. This election will be over in less than 3 months, at which point we're going to need a robust and battle-ready progressive movement that's strong enough to fight like hell, no matter who wins. Oh, this is such dangerous thinking. So now we need to unpack it. So a little bit of a battle ensued on Facebook. Keaton published the article, Why Progressives Shouldn't Fight Each Other Over How to Vote, and then this discussion got started. Amy Pfaff says, real progressives aren't fighting each other, which I agree with. We're voting Green Party because enough is enough. I'll skip down to what I said They differ from us only in that they feel too cornered in this particular election cycle to do anything but pull the lever for Joe Biden in November. That was a quote from the article. They feel too cornered to do anything but vote Biden. And I said, that would be like saying that a union worker who decides to cross a picket line to work for an exploitative employer while his brothers and sisters hold the line is not really a scab. Just because he feels too cornered doesn't mean he isn't doing something reprehensible. It doesn't mean he shouldn't be held accountable. Voting for Biden-Harris is at least as powerful a violation of ethical principles. Now we're talking about the principle of the thing. And voting still matters very much, if only for that reason, as being a scab. P.S. You are more than welcome to come on the show. I'm going to address your article either tomorrow or later this week. As it turns out, I'm going to go on Keaton's show, and then we're going to talk about this more, because Keaton is always ready for a good discussion. I said then, I didn't realize that you were advocating for keeping people in the MPP, Movement for a People's Party, fold, or whatever you would call the coalition that Nick Branya is trying to build. That's a type of mild sheepdogging, is it not? If potential MPP folks feel too cornered to do the right thing, and their progressive brethren let it slide, how is that different from when AOC sucks up to Mama Bear Pelosi? Should we let that slide? Where should we draw the line? I agree that voting doesn't do much. I disagree if you think that people who feel too cornered are worthy to call themselves progressives. Just think about it. That's how the Bernie or Bust movement got started. We can't pretend that Bernie's endorsement of HRC or Biden or Cop Kamala is okay, no matter how cornered we feel. These things still matter. If you think about it, it's the same kind of rationalizing that the DNC does when they say to settle for Biden, or even when they say vote blue no matter who. Compromise, even on a small scale, is why none of our progressive politicians are really doing anything substantial right now for the American people. Some of them are openly supporting U.S. imperialism as we speak. I know I don't sound very pragmatic. I can live with that. We're never going to get anywhere if we don't draw some hard lines and maintain them. I see so few people in the progressive movement, including politicians, pundits, and voters, who actually follow through and do the right thing when it comes to corporatism. Honestly, at this moment, I can't think of any. The reason the grassroots Bernie operatives started this offshoot in the first place was because of the selling out of people like Jeff Weaver, conveying to voters any sort of message that voting for corporatism is acceptable is akin, but not as severe, as Jeff Weaver raising dark corporate money and giving it to Joe Biden, or to Bernie Sanders even. Watching the Squad right now and other so-called progressives is extremely disheartening. The Movement for a People's Party is going to have to do better than our progressive politicians are doing if they want to successfully unrig the system on behalf of working class Americans. Keaton comes back and says, we'll talk more about this over the weekend, but just a quick response. When I wrote too cornered, I meant electorally in this cycle. That's different from some overall sense of powerlessness. A perfect example. One of the women I interviewed for my show recently has marched in over 20 Black Lives Matter protests since George Floyd's murder. At the most recent one, she put her body between one of these vicious, belligerent, white supremacist, cop-loving, back the blue dirtbags and one of her fellow protesters and got punched in the face by this guy, probably broke her nose. I have no idea how she plans to vote in November, and I honestly don't care. I'm not going to question her progressive bona fides over her voting preference if she's willing to go out and do the kind of direct action she's doing. I might disagree with her, but I'm not going to take that disagreement as far as to question her commitment to the cause of racial and economic justice, because she, in her direct action efforts, has already proven that she's the real deal, regardless of how she votes. And then I came back with, this may be a harsh example, but let's say that she also is a fellow employee with you and a fellow union member. Yes, she has established her credibility in all the ways you describe, and then has told you that economically speaking, she feels too cornered to honor the strike and has decided to be a scab for economic reasons. She might be willing to get punched in the face for social reasons, but what about when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of actually getting economic conditions improved for the working poor in a way that might jeopardize her own economic situation? Openly and publicly declaring that a vote for Biden-Harris is ethically unacceptable is another type of bona fide, and it is an important one. Otherwise, her feet, and the feet of everyone who looks the other way regarding her vote scabbing, are on a slippery slope that leads to oblivion for the progressive movement. And I'm going to coin that phrase, vote scabbing. I'd say anyone who crosses the line is not a progressive. You're not one of us. If you're not willing to hold the line and tell your fellow progressives, hey, you can't vote for Biden. Hey, you can't vote for Hillary. Hey, you can't vote for corporatism. You can't vote for corporate sock puppets. Then we're not really a movement anyway. And that's where I'll end it until we see Keaton this weekend.